J. Summers from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a distinguished fellow of the U.S. Army War College. I'm here on January 12th to speak to the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable on Richmond Redeemed, Enduring Lessons in Strategic Leadership from the Siege of Petersburg. It's part of my 60 years of study of the Civil War, much of it focusing on the Siege of Petersburg and reflected in this book, Richmond Redeemed. This is the expanded 150th anniversary edition that was published by Savage Beatty in 2014. And I'm very pleased to be here in Milwaukee sharing our interest in the Civil War tonight.
And in addition to getting a signed copy tonight, where else can you buy the book and the suggested retail price?
The book is available from the publisher Savage Beatty in El Dorado Hills, California. It can be ordered directly from Savage Beatty. It is also available through Amazon.com, through National Parks, Civil War battlefields, and through fine Civil War sellers all around the nation.
Thank you very much.
Tonight's speaker, Dick Summers, or appropriately Dr. Richard Summers. He's a retired historian, senior historian of the Army Heritage and Education Center. He was there for 40 years. He is also considered by the Army War College a distinguished fellow. In addition to the award he's gotten tonight, he's gotten many, many others. You look at your general version, you can read the whole list. It's phenomenal. The guests he brought tonight, they met at Rice University, where both of them got their PhDs. So he's a PhD from Rice, and his latest written work is, I believe, the book he has for sale, Richmond Redeemed, and it's going to be the subject of his topic. He spoke here once before, about 23 years ago, thereabouts.
Oh, about 43, actually.
43 years ago.
I'm a historian. I get dates right.
All righty then. Let's welcome Mr. Summers.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Frank, for that gracious introduction. I mentioned about dates, and it is important that we get them right, but history is about much more than dates. History is about life. Life past, but for the people who experienced it, it was their present. And we who share an interest in history, as all of us do, to come together on a night like this, but in such a wonderful setting as this, obviously have that interest in history. So I'm very pleased to be back here after the passage of so many decades to share with you thoughts on the Civil War. And I must tell you, your roundtable is especially important to me. Thanks to the father of my friend. My friend is Colonel Thomas R. Stone, Jr. His father, Mr. Thomas R. Stone, Sr., was a longtime member of this roundtable, very active in the mid-20th century. And because Tom's father had been so active in a roundtable and had had such a meaningful experience with it, Tom recommended to me when I moved to Pennsylvania to start my professional career that I might well be interested in joining the local Civil War Roundtable in Harrisburg, which I did. I served 3 terms as its president, 32 years as its program chairman, but most of all of these 45 plus years now in sharing in the experiences of people like you that have an interest in the Civil War. I might very well never have joined a roundtable if it had not been for my friend Tom relaying to me the wonderful experiences that his father had had right here in the Wisconsin Club with the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable. So many of the pleasures that I've enjoyed and the friendships that I've made over the last nearly half century now are thanks to your roundtable and to Mr. Stone. And so I want to affirm my gratitude to you here tonight. Now, I've come to speak on Richmond Redeemed, Enduring Lessons in Leadership from the Siege of Petersburg. The siege proved to be one of the longest operations of the Civil War, some 9.5 months, from mid-June of 1864 to early April of 1865. It pitted two of the greatest generals of American history directly against each other. Not against Braxton Bragg, not against John Floyd, not against Ambrose Burnside, but directly against each other. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. And it was waged by two of the finest armies of Americans that have ever been raised. The resilient Federal Army of the Potomac and the hard-hitting Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Those worthy antagonists, which had grappled for the entire war, were reinforced for the siege by new armies that had been created only in 1864. Serving in those armies were senior subordinates who had figured prominently in earlier battles in the Eastern Theater, such as 2nd Manassas, where the Iron Brigade earned its reputation in its preliminary fight at Groveton on August 28th, and Gettysburg, Antietam. These subordinates included prominent Northern commanders such as George G. Meade, Winfield Scott Hancock, Gouverneur K. Warren, and John Gibbon, and such senior Southern soldiers as James Longstreet, Richard S. Ewell, and A.P. Hill. Now, with that prelude, let us briefly summarize the siege before we essay to assess it. Petersburg, Virginia, situated on the right bank of the Appomattox River, 20 miles due south of Richmond, was militarily important in its own right. As the second largest city in Virginia, as the 7th largest city of the Confederacy, as the head of navigation on the Appomattox River, and as the site of the Confederate State Lead Works, which made bullets for the Confederate Army. However, the strategic significance of Petersburg lay in logistics. Throughout the Civil War, Petersburg functioned as the rail center for Richmond. From northeast, southeast, south, and west, railroads converged on Petersburg, or as it was nicknamed, the Cockade City. From Petersburg, a single railroad continued north to the Confederate capital. Foodstuffs from fertile South Side Virginia, armaments from ports to which blockade runners ran along the lower Atlantic coast, salt and lead from southwestern Virginia, and most vitally, reinforcements all funneled through Petersburg to Richmond. Only one other railroad, running southwest through Danville and the Carolina Piedmont, connected the capital with the rest of the Confederacy. Defending Petersburg and its supply lines thus was crucial to defending Richmond itself. Capturing the Cockade City could comparably cripple the capital. In the first 3 years of the Civil War, danger remained distant as Lee's masterful generalship kept the Unionists far from Richmond and its rail center. Ulysses S. Grant changed all that. By the spring of 1864, Grant served as General-in-Chief of the entire United States Army, as Eastern Theater Commander and as commander of what I like to call Army Group Grant. Now, admittedly, That's an anachronistic term, not in parlance in the Civil War, but it so accurately describes Grant's command. An army group is a group of armies that I think it's quite appropriate that we should use it to describe one of his key command functions. In all those capacities, he carried the war from central Virginia to the vicinity of Richmond in 30 days of almost incessant combat, from the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th and 6th to the Second Battle of Cold Harbor on June 1st to 3rd. The Illinoisan compelled the Confederates to concede their forward position and confronted them with the constriction of the close and confined coverage of their capital. Then, in a daring southward strike in mid-June, Grant crossed the Chickahominy River, crossed the mighty James River itself, and attacked the capital's communications center, Petersburg. His leading corps overran the outer defenses, but did not capture the cockade city itself. Federal failure to recognize opportunity, plus heroic defense by the Butternuts, first under P.G.T. Beauregard and then under Lee himself, saved the city. A grand assault by the Unionists on June 18th was bloodily repulsed. Even worse disaster befell the Yankee efforts to cut the communications south of the cockade city in the First Battle of the Weldon Railroad, less than a week later. Those dual defeats on June 18th and June 22nd, 23rd ended the mobile warfare of spring that had carried the armies from the Rapidan River to the Appomattox. Thereafter, operations stagnated into the slowness of summer as the siege of Petersburg began. Now, this siege was not tactical. It lacked the saps and parallels and breaching batteries that had characterized European siege warfare since the age of French Marshal Vauban in the reign of King Louis XIV. Even the several mines at Petersburg, including the infamous Battle of the Crater on July 30th, were aberrations utterly uncharacteristic of the siege. Yet Petersburg unquestionably was a siege on the higher planes of operations, strategy, even grand strategy. In essence, Grant used the siege to fix the graycoats in place at Petersburg and Richmond, and thus to deny Lee the operational and strategic initiative which the Virginian had used to such good advantage earlier in the war. Grant's great entrenched camp close up against Petersburg from the east, with its incessant shelling and sharpshooting, created an ongoing threat which the Southerners could not ignore. More dangerous were the attacks, some of them two-pronged, others first strike, which Grant launched from the security of that camp against undermanned positions north of James River and against vulnerable supply lines south of Petersburg. 9 such attacks, which I have termed offensives, punctuated the 9.5 months of the siege. Most were marked by mobile battles in the open field rather than by assaults on well-defended positions. The most significant of these strikes were the 4th offensive in mid-August, which cut the vital Weldon Railroad linking Petersburg to the blockade runners' ports on the lower Atlantic, the 5th offensive, about which I've written in Richmond Redeemed in late September, which nearly compelled Lee to abandon Petersburg and which threw Richmond itself into the greatest peril of capture by a field army that could actually have held the city, not a handful of cavalry raiders, but a field army that the city faced any day of the whole Civil War. That was the 5th offensive. And then the 8th offensive in early February, which extended the federal left flank to Hatcher's Run. And finally, the 9th offensive in late March, which netted both Petersburg and Richmond themselves. Overnight, April 2nd, 3rd, 1865, Lee abandoned his communications center, abandoned his James River defenses, abandoned his capital itself for a last desperate flight down the Danville Railroad toward North Carolina. But North Carolina proved too distant. The butternut brigades had been too badly battered throughout the siege. The Federal Army was in too advantageous a position. 1 week to the day after the final fighting at Petersburg came Appomattox. By the spring of 1865, indeed ever since late 1864, the siege had assumed strategic dimensions. Grant made this clear in his letter of December 18th to his trusted friend and subordinate William T. Sherman, who had just completed his devastating march to the sea. My own opinion, wrote the General-in-Chief, is that Lee is averse to going out of Virginia, and if the cause of the South is lost, he wants Richmond to be the last place surrendered. If Lee has such views, it may be well to indulge him until we have everything else in our hands. That is the essence of a strategic siege. Grant pinning Lee at Petersburg while Sherman and Philip H. Sheridan and George H. Thomas devoured the rest of the Confederacy. That is how siege warfare is waged at the level of grand strategy. So, now, I have it. What? In 10 minutes, I've summarized the 10 months of siege. But I'm not done. I've come to share with you some thoughts on the generalship and lessons of leadership of the siege. The various mobile field battles which marked each offensive are fascinating, and indeed, the first time that I spoke to your roundtable in September of 1973, I talked on one of those combats, the Battle of Poplar Spring Church, in which the 37th and 38th Wisconsin and the famous Iron Brigade were very much engaged, and such prominent Badger State commanders as General Edward Bragg and General Samuel Harriman figured very prominently. But it's not so much these tactical operations that I'd like for us to consider tonight, but rather that we broaden our focus to the operational, strategic, even grand strategic levels. So let me share with you a few thoughts from those perspectives. An operation lasting 9.5 months proclaims perseverance, both its prizes and its pitfalls. Grant's bulldog tenacity in grabbing hold of the Army of Northern Virginia in the wilderness of Spotsylvania and never letting go all the way through Petersburg to Appomattox is one of the greatest hallmarks of his generalship. Yet just what did this tenacity, this perseverance entail at Petersburg? Part of it, as we have seen, involved fixing the Southerners in place tactically, operationally, and strategically. Yet fixing in place did not come easily. Time and again, in the mobile field battles south of Petersburg and north of James River, Grant was defeated tactically. Even so, he managed to weave such setbacks into operational and strategic success. He achieved such success despite those battlefield setbacks because he remained undaunted. His calm, quiet confidence in himself gave him the determination to keep up the struggle. And then, too, his assurance in his own mind of ultimate federal victory in the siege and in the war enabled him to press ahead despite temporary setbacks. Together, such self-confidence and such certainty of success gave him military peace of mind, which freed him from the doubt, fear, anxiety, and torment that had vexed so many other senior commanders on both sides, and which thus enabled him to focus on succeeding in the siege and on winning the war. Yet within that military peace of mind, Grant was neither arrogant nor bullheaded. An even greater hallmark of his strategic leadership than tenacity was his ability to learn and to apply the lessons of experience. Such a faculty had won him victory at Vicksburg. It also produced the prize at Petersburg. When he perceived that frontal attacks, which had worked so well here in the Western Theater, brought only heavy losses in the East, culminating in the disastrous repulse of June 18th, he explicitly forbade such assaults against well-defended fortified positions. He launched no further attacks throughout the siege until the final onslaught on April 2nd. Again, when experience demonstrated that sequential two-pronged attacks on both sides of James River were not working, he progressively adjusted their timing until by late October they were both simultaneous. And when even that approach did not work, he made a more fundamental readjustment to go not with two prongs, but with a massive first strike with his left wing, and it was that approach that carried him to Hatcher's Run in February, and that approach that defeated the last Confederate mobile reserves at Five Forks and broke through at Boysaw's Farm, where Pamplin Park now stands, and produced victory at Petersburg. Yet Grant was not the only senior leader to display perseverance at Petersburg. His Confederate counterpart also showed tenacity in holding that city and Richmond. Lee understood their practical and symbolic importance to the Southern war effort and to the Southern cause, and he fought to save those cities. Fought is the key concept here. Lee did not sit supinely in his trenches awaiting blue coat attack. When the Yankees left their defenses of their entrenched camp to attack him, he left his defenses to counterattack them. Although he never again controlled the strategic initiative, which remained in Grant's hands throughout the siege, the great Confederate commander repeatedly challenged the Yankees for control of the tactical and operational initiatives. The ensuing battles were not static, set-piece struggles of attack and defense, but fluid, mobile field battles in which the secessionists' superior knowledge of terrain often enabled them to offset their numerical weakness with surprise flank attacks. Counterattacking attackers affords tactical advantages. Even more significantly, those counterattacks reflected Lee's approach to warfare. He did not equate probable disadvantage with certain loss, but rather strove to redirect unfavorable situations to his advantage. By way of contrast, Joe Johnston in Georgia, when threatened, would fall back. Lee, when threatened, fought back. In the operations that I've covered in the book here tonight, Lee was prepared to abandon Petersburg on September 30th, if necessary, to save Richmond. Yet he did not yield to such likely danger, but battled back and saved both cities. Through such fighting tenacity, Lee prolonged the security of his supply lines, his army, his capital, and his country for another 9 months. And yet, the end eventually came, and all were lost. This outcome was due, at least in part, because the Graycoats held on to Petersburg too long. Now, I do not blame Lee for this decision or for this outcome. He did not become general-in-chief of all Confederate armies until February of 1865, too late to affect the course of the war. The decision to remain in Richmond rested with the government. As a professional soldier of the Confederate Republic, Lee loyally carried out government policy. But there is an aspect of perseverance, however, where Lee at Petersburg may be criticized. Unlike Grant, who learned from experience, the Virginian continued fighting in ways that had worked well earlier in the war, but that were no longer applicable by mid-1864. Unlike at Gaines' Mill, Second Manassas, or Chancellorsville, Lee's counterattacks at Petersburg almost never drove the Union strike force from the field. At best, they simply stopped that force short of its objective. Follow-up counterattacks invariably failed to overcome the Federals. Instead, they simply produced mounting Confederate casualties with no corresponding conquests. For Lee at Petersburg, the old ways no longer worked. Such hallmarks of generalship characterized the exercise of command by Lee and Grant at Petersburg. Yet with armies ranging from approximately 50,000 to 60,000 secessionists and from about 100,000 to 125,000 bluecoats, those two commanders obviously could not control everything themselves, but had to rely on senior subordinates. Here too lay lessons in leadership. To begin with, both commanding generals worked with and through their senior subordinates, not around or despite them. They accorded their responsible subordinates latitude to exercise the responsibility of those offices. As theater commander and Army Group commander, the Illinoisan focused on strategy and left operations and tactics to his Army and Corps commanders. Army of the Potomac commander Meade earned and retained Grant's respect, although the two generals never became close personally, the way Grant was close to Sherman. The other Yankee Army commander, Benjamin F. Butler of the Army of the James, was the quintessential political general of the Union Army. But despite his many shortcomings as a field commander, Grant both recognized the Massachusetts man's talents and also understood the necessity of working with such an influential politician. Not until Butler finally discredited himself with the powder boat fiasco in December of 1864 did the general-in-chief finally have grounds for removing the insubordinate subordinate. Butler's successor was the able professional soldier Edward Ord, who had earned Grant's respect and friendship in the Western theater. Because Grant liked Ord, the junior officers' quaint conceits were tolerated. But such antics by other senior subordinates usually cost them Grant's respect and therefore their commands. William F. Smith, William T.H. Brooks, and Quincy Adams Gilmore were all relieved of command when they demanded actions or promotions that Grant was unwilling to grant them. And John Gibbon of Iron Brigade renown almost suffered the same fate. Much more tragically, by the final hours of the siege, Gouverneur Warren had so drained the reservoir of goodwill that he had earned on Little Round Top that neither Meade nor Grant would save him from the implacable wrath of Phil Sheridan. Now, Sheridan's practice of summarily relieving generals on the field of battle was atypical of the Siege of Petersburg and of command style in the Civil War. More characteristic was Grant's practice of avoiding wholesale house cleanings of subordinates and instead working with and through them until they either succeeded or discredited themselves with their ineptitude or their overweening ambition. Lee's command style was similar. Earlier in the war, to be sure, he had cleansed the Army of Northern Virginia of senior subordinates who had not measured up. By the time Petersburg was besieged, however, the terrible attrition of his general officers reduced him to working with and through those who remained. By then, the great Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart were dead, and James Longstreet had been severely wounded in the Wilderness. The best of Lee's subordinates at Petersburg was Beauregard, but he departed on September 23rd and soon thereafter was assigned to command the Western Theater. A month later, the able Longstreet returned to duty. Among newcomers to Corps Command, Wade Hampton and John B. Gordon proved promising, but Richard H. Anderson was disappointing. Then, too, Richard S. Ewell and A.P. Hill had never lived up to expectations. Indeed, just before the armies besieged Petersburg, Ewell was politely eased out of field command and put in charge of the Department of Richmond. By then, however, the capital was no backwater. The Richmond sector proved a prominent portion of the Petersburg siege lines, and there Ewell rendered his most crucial contribution to the Confederate cause by saving the capital during the Federal attack on September 29th in the operations that are covered in Richmond Redeemed. Yet whether subordinates are able or not, they are the tools with which senior leaders must work. The chain of command, moreover, runs upward as well as downward. One of the greatest strengths of both Grant and Lee is that they understood the proper relationship between the uniformed general-in-chief and the constitutional commander-in-chief in a republic at war. They not only worked for, but also with President Lincoln and President Davis, and certainly not against them. Those great generals earned and retained the respect of their chief executives, and thus were accorded the latitude to apply their professional talents in service to their embattled nations. Contrast their success with what became Beauregard, Joe Johnston, McClellan, Rosecrans, and so many other high-ranking officers, South and North, who nullified their own professional talents by constantly quarreling with their respective governments, and who thus were kept on close rein, marginalized, or shunted aside altogether. This ability to work with the president comes through clearly in the following correspondence between Grant and Lincoln in mid-July of 1864, a month into the siege of Petersburg. In my opinion, wrote the Lieutenant General, there ought to be an immediate call for, say, 300,000 more men to be put in the field in the shortest possible time. Grant then specified many benefits from increasing the fighting force, and finally he summarized, the greater number of men we have, the shorter and less bloody will be the war. Yet, Grant did not stop there, but went on to make clear, now quoting him again, I give this entirely as my views and not in any spirit of dictation, always holding myself in readiness to use the material given me to the best advantage I know how. The following day, the president replied, yours of yesterday about a call for 300,000 men is received. I suppose you have not yet seen the call for 500,000 men made the day before, and which I suppose covers the case. Always glad to have your suggestions. So close and so effective were the bonds that between Lincoln and Grant that the president not only welcomed the general's suggestion, but actually engaged in a little harmless humor about them. Not that war was a laughing matter, but that the two men were close enough to savor a smile as together they strove for success. That exchange not only underscores the effective working relations between them, it also provides other lessons in strategic leadership. Grant recognized the benefit of applying overwhelming force, and he realized that the North possessed such power potentially. His great talent lay in understanding how to convert advantages into achievements. Yet all the while, Grant did not demand perfection, unlike some senior leaders who insisted on waiting until everything was perfectly arranged and who thus often waited forever. Grant was willing to give it a try with whatever resources were at hand. Those resources often sufficed to produce positive results. The president liked those results, and he liked the attitude of the general who was always willing to act. Lee, too, was willing to act, but under much different circumstances. He knew that the South had fewer soldiers and fewer resources, and he realized that time was not on his side. He could not wait for perfection of positions, powers, and plans, for they remained unattainable. He instead tried to make his own perfection in outcomes by seizing the strategic and operational initiative or by wresting it from the Yankees. In 1862 and 1863, he often managed to achieve such results. By the time that Petersburg was besieged, however, Grant controlled the strategic and operational initiative, and Lee was reduced to fending off the federal offensives. Yet as we consider Grant and Lee and their senior subordinates, it is important that we not mistake them for the magnificent monuments that grace our national battlefields and our public places today. The statues of Meade and Hancock, Lee and Longstreet at Gettysburg, of Grant looking down the National Mall in Washington, or Wade Hampton in Columbia, South Carolina. Those giant sculptures in bronze and marble honor the generals, but they are not the generals. The generals themselves, we must always keep in mind, were real, live human beings with varying degrees of the qualities, noble and ignoble, which mark the human condition. Courage and heroism and honor and perseverance and vision, to be sure, but also rivalry and jealousy and resentment and bitterness and vindictiveness. By the time that the armies reached Petersburg in mid-June of 1864, the soldiers were exhausted, physically and psychologically, from over 6 weeks of incessant fighting and marching and fighting yet again. And so were their commanders. During the hot, dry, seemingly ceaseless siege, anger flared among Meade and his corps commanders and division commanders, and among Confederate division commanders as well. Such strife certainly affected command relations and sometimes affected operations. Such personal animosity is not confined to Petersburg, to the Civil War, or to olden times. It can flare up today and tomorrow. Senior strategic leaders need to recognize that reality and to be prepared to deal with it. So understanding the human dimension of high command is just one of the lessons from the siege. Persevering, weaving tactical setbacks into strategic success, adapting flexibility of methods to fixity of purpose, not yielding to possible threats, but fighting back against the odds, displaying strategic vision, converting advantages into achievements, functioning effectively within chains of commands, upward, downward, and laterally. All these are enduring lessons in leadership from the siege of Petersburg when Richmond was redeemed. And I thank you. Yes.
We have some questions? Any questions?
Does Tom have a question there?
Okay, you've got General Grant from the west coming east. He kind of changed the perspectives of the Army of the Potomac. He didn't apply Western value, maybe initially he did, in terms of attack. But Grant, as I look at him, he did change after the spring of 1864 and after Cold Harbor. He did in the siege. He was the same man, but at the same time, he did change his perspectives. Is that how you would see it?
Very much so. I think it's very understandable as we consider how Grant waged his operations in Virginia in May of 1864, that we look at his command experiences from earlier in the war. And from Belmont through Forts Henry and Donaldson to Shiloh, not Shiloh Sunday, but Shiloh Monday, throughout the Vicksburg campaign, right up to raising the siege of Chattanooga, Grant had achieved battlefield success and strategic success, had earned promotion to Major General of Volunteers, to Brigadier General and Major General of Regulars, to Lieutenant General in the regular Army, the first American officer since George Washington to hold that grade, had earned promotion to General-in-Chief by carrying the attack to the Confederates, not only strategically, but tactically upon the field of battle. So this approach to warfare that had served the Union so well in the West was very understandably the approach that he applied when he came east. But from the wilderness through Cold Harbor, and I would date it beyond June 3rd, all the way to the great attack on June 18th, Grant is learning a very bloody lesson that frontal attacks don't work against Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And so Grant makes the fundamental decision to change his approach. It's one of Grant's greatest talents. He's not a military genius. He's the first to acknowledge that. But he can perceive the lessons of experience and can apply them to produce important results. We always say this about his approach to capturing Vicksburg, whether it's the Mississippi Central Campaign, the Yazoo Pass, Steele's Bayou, Lake Providence, the Duckport Canal, whatever is the approach he takes, and it doesn't work. He tries something else, and finally he marches the army down to Hard Times in Bruinsburg and crosses over to the left bank of the Mississippi and defeats the Confederates and captures Vicksburg. That was not unique to the period from late October of 62 to early July of 63. That is Grant's hallmark for the whole war, and it will again characterize his generalship in Virginia in 1864 and 65. And he makes this fundamental change after June 18th, and in his orders, he explicitly prohibits his Army and Corps commanders from making frontal attacks. June 3rd at Cold Harbor no more characterizes the generalship of Ulysses S. Grant than Malvern Hill typifies the generalship of Robert E. Lee. Both of those excellent commanders were far superior to those two unfortunate days in the war. Dan?
In the relationship between Davis and Lee, is Davis somewhat remiss earlier in the war of not being stronger against Lee and doing more in other parts of the Confederacy rather than leave Lee to husband his troops in Virginia?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. Dan, I think President Davis very clearly is conscious of the importance of the West. After all, he had been born in Kentucky, had grown up in Mississippi. He understood the importance, especially of Vicksburg and the Western theater. I don't think that Lee is being parochial, and you did not accuse him of that, but some writers and have called Lee selfish and narrow-minded Virginian. And I don't see it that way. Lee was a professional soldier. Think about his career in the old Army after he graduated from West Point. Yes, he was assigned to build Fort Monroe, which happened to be in Virginia. He was also assigned to work on Fort McHenry and Fort Carroll in Maryland, Fort Hamilton in New York Harbor, Lake Erie, St. Louis, Fort Pulaski in Georgia, to fight Comanches on the plains of Texas, to fight Mexicans from Veracruz to the city of Mexico. Wherever his orders as a professional soldier took him, there Lee went and served to the best of his ability and earned a tremendous reputation for accomplishments and for prospects in the old Army. So now he becomes, not just for a very brief period, the commander of the State Army of Virginia, but soon a professional soldier of the Confederate nation. And he does not insist on remaining in his native tidewater. He will go to the far Appalachian country of northwestern Virginia, which today is West Virginia. He will go to the lower Atlantic coast when he is sent there. He will carry out his duty, whatever it is. And when he was entrusted with command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1st of 1862, it became his responsibility to prosecute the Confederate war effort in the Eastern Theater. So I don't think it's narrow-minded or selfish of him to seek to have the troops to be able to do this, and frankly, I think that he has shown a better record of being able to achieve something with those troops than any Confederate commander in the Western Theater showed with being able to use troops out west. So even if President Davis had ordered Lee to send some troops to the west, I think it's highly questionable that John C. Pemberton, Joe Johnston, and especially Braxton Bragg could have used those troops to good advantage. To the extent that the Confederates have a chance anywhere, it's Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia that's going to give them that chance. And I think it's quite understandable that President Davis placed so much confidence in Lee and his army to achieve that.
Dick, as someone who's had the pleasure of knowing you for almost a half century, and who has actually read your book and enjoyed it, would you share with us, seriously, I've often wondered about this, how you happened upon the subject?
Well, thank you, Tom. You know, all of us who share a love of the Civil War, as obviously everyone here tonight does, has certain approaches that we like to take. We have old favorites, whoever they may be, whatever these battles may be. It might be the Battle of Gettysburg. With the Iron Brigade, it might be the Battle of Groveton, or July 1st at Gettysburg, or Shiloh, or Chickamauga, or whatever is the battle. We might have our favorite generals. My wife Tracy's favorite generals are John Buford and James Longstreet and Wade Hampton. I'm sure we all have our favorite generals. Well, in my approach to the Civil War, even though the whole war interests me, I do not want so much to revisit well-plowed ground, but to open up something new that had not previously received much, if any, attention. And that was very much true with the siege of Petersburg. We're talking now about, as you said, Tom, half a century ago. We're talking about the time of the Civil War centennial in the mid-1960s. People tended to equate this siege of Petersburg with the Battle of the Crater, which was totally uncharacteristic of the siege, if they gave it any attention at all. People who started writing about the Civil War with Fort Sumter and First Manassas, or First Bull Run, let me call it here, with the Second Wisconsin and its epic fighting in July of '61, who began writing there and are planning to cover the whole war, are often tired by the time they get to mid-1864. They're behind schedule. Their publishers are pressing them to meet the deadline. Come on, get done, get the book out. So with the paucity of readily available sources, it's very easy to go hop, skip, and a jump from June 15th to the Crater, to Five Forks, and on to Appomattox, and be done with it, and here's my completed manuscript. Well, I didn't begin with Fort Sumter or First Bull Run. I decided I'd begin with the siege of Petersburg, and more particularly to pick some of these operations, these offensives as I came to call them, and if I may be allowed to say so, I have largely defined the terminology with which the National Park Service and virtually all historians, my dear friend Ed Barse and most everyone else, now frame studies of the siege of Petersburg, because nothing had been written on the siege since General Humphreys, who was a participant, wrote his book in 1883. Well, when I was an undergraduate student at Carleton College in nearby Minnesota, and I know there were many Wisconsinites who went to Carleton when I was there and still go there, I wrote a senior paper on Grant's fourth offensive, the siege of Petersburg, the August operations, 2nd Deep Bottom, Globe Tavern, 2nd Ream Station. So it was just natural chronologically to follow along for my graduate work with the 5th offensive, the Battle of Fort Harrison and Poplar Spring Church. I didn't realize how important they were when I began that study. I dare say no one had known, no one in the mid-20th century, that Lee was prepared to abandon Petersburg on September 30th, if necessary, to save Richmond. But he was, and I found that out in my research. So I want to open up these new areas. And I must say, it's been wonderfully gratifying in the 34 years, third of a century, between the time that the first edition of Richmond Redeemed was published and this new, expanded, updated 150th anniversary came out. Many other people have written on various aspects of the siege. Ed Barsh, Jack Davis, Andy Trudeau, right here in Wisconsin, Tom Horn on the first offensive. Will Green is going to be coming out with a 3-volume work on the entire siege. And I'm so happy that the siege is receiving the attention that it deserves, because I wanted to open up something new, and truly it is being opened up thanks to the follow-on work of so many fine historians, and I'm gratified to have been able to play some part in that regard.
Anyone else? Failing to see any other raised hands. Dick, Certificate of Honor by the Order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Richard Summers for devotion to the preservation of the memory of the gallant men of principle and their noble deeds in the war between the states, and for dedication to perpetuating the traditions of our common country. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you.
I have one more item for you, believe it or not. After the Civil War, the veterans of the Iron Brigade Association, or the veterans of the Iron Brigade, formed the Iron Brigade Association. In the late 19th century, they opened membership up to their descendants. In 1990, 2 sons of veterans of the Iron Brigade gave custodianship of the Iron Brigade Association to the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. It is my extreme pleasure to present to you a lapel pin signifying membership in the Iron Brigade Association.
Thank you so much. I'm greatly honored. I'll put this right here on my lapel. We do have copies of the book over here. It's not a mere reprint of the original. There's a lot of new content, especially new analysis along the lines that we talked about tonight, and we are offering it as a discount, at a discount to the Milwaukee Roundtable. So if anyone would be interested, Tracy and I will be at this table over here.
Thank you, sir. That was very interesting. So what, you adapt, improvise, and overcome? Is that how you do it? When they keep beating you back, you readjust and drive on? That's how we learn. February the 9th, we are Stewart's Christmas Tree. I'm sure I'm not familiar with that. I'm sorry. I guess I'll have to learn something next month, too. Yeah. Our next meeting is on the 9th. It'll be here. Hopefully the weather will be a little better. Thank you to our guest speaker. Thank you very much. His books are over here. Please come by and see him. And if there's nothing else, we are adjourned. I'll see you next week, or next month, excuse me. Good night.